in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am super excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Daisy Auger-Domínguez. She's the Chief People Officer at Vice Media Group and author of Inclusion Revolution. Daisy, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Christina. Thrilled to be here. My pronouns are she, her, and ella. And I grew up in the Dominican Republic. And so growing up, what I often heard my grandmother who raised me say was that I was going to someday be a professional. So when I grew up, I just knew that I was going to be a professional. I had no idea what that meant. I just knew it was going to be special and big because my grandmother thought it so.
I love that. I used to live in a two-family house with my grandparents, very close with my grandma. So I remember hearing what she thought I was going to be as well. I know you wear many hats, and one of them is an author, and I have so many questions around that. But before we get into it, I would love to ask, what defines you, Daisy?
You know, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, and I'm a navigator of new ways of work.
I love it. I think that's a lot. There's a lot going on there, and I love that you led with kind of the different roles you have in life in general, not just your work as well. I know a lot of people have been thinking about that. As a chief people officer and a leader in the people space, how are you thinking about this dynamic thing of company culture, measuring it both quantitatively and qualitatively?
Oh goodness. I mean, culture is everything. And it is both the most nebulous concept to think about and also the most concrete. I often tell my team culture starts with what people do and how they do it. It sets the context for everything that we do, how we do it. It is the highest form of your brand as an organization. And it encompasses the values and behaviors that contribute to the social and psychological environment of an organization, right? It's how we feel and it's how others make us feel. I often think of a story about when I worked at the Walt Disney Company. I found it fascinating that our creative talent, writers, directors, animators, they were treated like royalty, Christina. They were mostly male, so yeah. I should say kings. But that logically makes sense because they were the generators of the content and the storytelling that generates the franchises and revenue that make the Walt Disney Company one of the world's most iconic and successful companies. But I would soon learn that there was more to it than that. It had begun in the early days of the now over 100-year-old company when Walt Disney, Uncle Walt, as we used to call him, when Walt Disney created the company, he prized creativity above all else. And so much so that the original 9 animators, they were called the 9 old men, they sat on the same wing as Walt on the top floor. So while Walt was a proponent of a collaborative creative process, and this has been highly documented, he built a hierarchy of whose creativity and talents were most important that still exists today in the organization, quite frankly. And in some cases, that hierarchy was also to the detriment of the creativity that built the company. And I share that story because, you know, culture is also about why people do what they do. And that sense of culture, we often think that it just happens, that it's by happenstance, that it just, you know, sort of, you know, it's in the water that we drink, it's in our DNA, but yeah. it is designed. and just as it can be designed to operate in one way, it can be designed to operate in another way. And so when you ask me about how do you measure it, I think about it from a qualitative perspective. It's those common set of behaviors and underlying mindsets and beliefs that shape how people work and how they interact day to day. And that's, that can be measured from the way that we review and consider our values as an organization, right? At the heart of organizations' cultures are commonly shared values, where how some people exhibit those values and how others don't gets to be a little bit of the challenge of this work. It's who do you reward, who do you recognize, do you have a people orientation, do you have a team orientation, do you have an attention to detail culture, is innovation or aggressiveness part of the norms of your organization? And that's the qualitative way of sussing out a culture, if you will. And then on the quantitative side, employee sentiment, that can be measured in many different ways. And there are many organizations like yours who are constantly looking at that work. And, one of them is company satisfaction. Do people like to work here? do they, a standard question in employee surveys is, do you intend to work here for, in the next 3 to 5 years? That's a way of gauging company satisfaction. Job satisfaction. Do you like your job? Do you like the work that you're doing? These questions around belonging and inclusion, which I write about this in Inclusion Revolution. There are a lot of standard questions around belonging. Do you feel that you belong? Do you feel seen, heard, and valued? But there's also the counter to that of why would I want to answer a question about belonging and inclusion in a place where I don't feel a sense of belonging and inclusion, right? So there's a lot of nuance to how you ask these questions and how you measure this. How do you measure your company values, your communications, your decision-making processes, how managers manage, how leaders lead, your benefits and compensation, how inclusive they are, how equitable they are. There are so many different ways of measuring this. And I think that the companies who do this in a comprehensive way, in a consistent way, that allows you to watch trends and that actually take that information to course correct, not simply to react to what's happening in the moment, but using your data and the input that you're getting from your employees to course correct and to change, and frankly, sometimes overcorrect where needed. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that's definitely helpful. And in terms of culture, I like what you said about it doesn't just happen, by coincidence, just because people say, we want to work at a really great place. How does that actually manifest? What are your values? How are you living them out? What behavior are you really rewarding, verbal and nonverbal norms in an organization as well? It all plays into this big dynamic monster of company culture, and it's changing all the time. So how are you listening to employees? How is everybody experiencing, feeling that sense of belonging too is super important.
And what questions you're asking, right? I think that, and I write about this a lot in Inclusion Revolution, and I talk about it a lot because I've had to learn to ask better questions, right? There's observation. And as managers and leaders, our job is to observe our teams, to really get to know our people. And then there's examination of workplace behavior. And that happens in meetings, in discussions, in interviews, in decision-making opportunities. The examination of practices that often go unquestioned is so critical. And there's so much to uncover and to share. And so some of the questions that we can be asking is, what do people say about your company now versus 2 years ago? Has that changed? What does that look like? What voices may be missing in your conversations and in your decision-making? Who takes up too much space? Who feels silenced? Right. You'll be surprised by what you discover when you listen and when you ask these questions differently.
You ask these really curiosity-based questions and then actively listen and demonstrate that to the folks you are listening to as well. And I like what you said about whose voices are you not hearing too, and course correcting is super important. How can organizations really identify those hidden cracks or dangers in inequity processes, or maybe misunderstandings in alignment or values, and proactively find them by really empowering folks to speak up no matter where they are in the organization?
Creating a speak up culture, Christina, is, takes time. But it's quite basic, I believe. It really is fundamentally about creating the workplace that we all want. We all want to feel seen. We all want to feel heard. We all want to feel understood. It's a basic human need. And, and in order to create, what I call speak up culture, and a place where there's a sense of psychological safety, where people do not fear saying what is right in front of them and what they discover, you have to make trust and respect part of your team's culture, right? Great teams thrive on trust. It's essential to challenge lack of respect immediately and politely, and and in front of everyone who heard the disrespect. That's we call that modeling, right? But being thoughtless about people's feelings and experiences can shut them down. So at a minimum, we have to create ways for employees to anonymously report complaints of inappropriate behavior by their coworkers, by their managers, their leaders, whoever it is. You've got to also focus on skill building, because this doesn't come naturally to everyone. For some of us who have experienced microaggressions and feeling marginalized and alone in workplaces, we have to also build our own skills and address that. And those who have inadvertently been marginalizing and silencing others have to build their own skill set for listening better, asking better questions, taking action when change needs to happen, developing your racial and gender equity understanding as you build trust within your team is also critical. So that level of cultural competency that, for years we've thought, you'll build it with an inclusion training, or you'll build it with an unconscious bias training. Yes, and right, it's got to be part of an ongoing learning journey and growth journey for yourself and your teams, in order to create a space where people truly feel that they can speak up and that they can be, they can bring their true selves to the workplace in a way that will not come back, to hurt them.
That cultural competency and that self-awareness and internal work is really important, and that really manifests in the questions you asked, how you engage with people, how you show up in the room. And I know in your book you talk about it, and in your TED Talk, Inclusion Revolution, you talk specifically around kind of holding up that mirror to yourself and finding someone in your career who was your first professional mirror, which I love the phrase. And one of the things that stood out to me was that one of your advocates said, what you're feeling is relatable, and I know it's different for you. So odds are throughout your career, folks listening, your manager or your mentor or supervisor won't share the exact same identity as you. How can we intentionally train and provide resources to new managers to be really effective mirrors?
Oh, Christina, that's such an important piece. And the first part of Inclusion Revolution, I intentionally focused on building readiness for the reader, because before you start doing this work, you have to do your own work. And the model that I share in the book is a 4-step model. It's reflect, visualize, act, and persist. And that reflection piece is where you're essentially holding up a mirror. Because understanding how deep bias runs in your workplace starts with you recognizing your own blind spots and assumptions, and determining what you want to achieve for yourself and your organization. And the way that you build those muscles. That's what I don't talk about training a lot. I talk about building muscles, about building skill sets and capabilities. The way that you build those muscles is by engaging in deep learning and observation and experience and questioning. I always tell people, you have to ask yourself a few basic questions. The first is, what motivates me to build a diverse workforce and inclusive culture? Because many times we tell managers and leaders, and I have worked in some of the world's most admired companies who want to do this work and haven't quite gotten it right yet. And we just launch these initiatives without actually spending some deep personal time thinking about, why do I want to build a diverse workforce, right? Why is inclusion important to me? What events or people in the past have made me who I am today? Are there beliefs that I have given up on? Are there beliefs that I really hold on to and that may or may not come in conflict with these conversations? How do I navigate that? We also have to ask ourselves, Christina, what makes me nervous? or feel or fearful or confused, right? Let me say that again. We also have to ask ourselves, what makes me nervous, fearful, or confused about doing this work? Because this work doesn't come naturally to everyone, right? There are moments of shame and concern, and and a lot of fear about misstepping or saying the
Right.
wrong thing. And we have to really spend some time with ourselves, asking ourselves those questions, because that's what builds the readiness to do this work, to examine the root causes of why we still have predominantly white institutions. And I say that intentionally, Christina, because we often ask the question, how do we build a more diverse workforce? I like to ask the question, what are the conditions that have kept this workplace predominantly white? Because that's a different way of looking at it, right? That forces your brain to think a little differently. And the answers may be similar, but we've for so long been tackling a problem, right, that we believe is based on, well, we can't bring any more, or we can't bring enough people of color and LGBTQ and veterans, and you name the non-normative group, we can't bring them into the organization. And we don't spend enough time thinking about why is this organization still predominantly this this composition, right? What is it about our recruitment process, our onboarding process, our performance management process, our referral process, our internship process, all of the processes that make up the system that we operate in? And so those are, that to me, that's the way that you equip and enable managers to think more inclusively by pushing themselves to really dig deep into their own biases and assumptions, and then invest and spend the time visualizing what kind of leader they want to be and how do they want to go about it.
Mm-hmm. Those are definitely critical questions around where am I feeling uncomfortable. You're right, this work does not come naturally to a lot of people. And for some folks, this is something that is definitely new to them as well. And they're exploring for the first time. Some people have been doing this work all of their life, 20 years, lived experiences, both professional experiences too. In terms of that systems aspect, what role do you see an employer really having in helping employees, so not just leaders, really doing this internal work and self-reflection, knowing that everybody is in a different part of their journey, careers, life?
It is fundamentally every employer's responsibility to enable their entire organization to operate and to thrive. Because at the end of the day, every organization has a product to create, a content to deliver, whatever it is that you're producing, you need this mix of people to do it. And I think that the train has left the station, if you will, on this concept of whether diversity, equity, and inclusion is important, right? There's plenty of research and evidence to prove it. The correlation can be a little weak in some areas, but fundamentally, this is important work. This is, quite frankly, the biggest business imperative of our times, of how do we build workplaces that are truly inclusive across an intersection of identities, right? We have for so long made it either just a gendered issue or just a race issue. And the fact of the matter is you and I live this world in an intersectional way. We are, we may identify as, as women, we may identify as women of color. You asked me at the beginning, how do I define myself? I identify as a mother, as, as a sister, as a friend. I identify as a cisgendered heterosexual woman, right? Like this is who I am. But on any given day, I'm not one or the other. I am all of that. And it is an employer's responsibility to ensure that the people that they are bringing into their organization to deliver on their mission and goals and their business objectives are able to do so in a fair, safe, and dignified way.
Absolutely. I think it is a requirement as well. And there is a ton of research to support that, anecdotal, talking to your team as well. When people feel seen, heard, and understood, they do their best work and are more likely to speak up and give that feedback in terms of identity and the language that we are using too. From a global perspective, we know that diversity, for example, means something different in North America than it does in South America, than it does in other kind of hemispheres as well. And you've worked at a lot of global organizations too. How have you navigated a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy from both a global and local perspective? What I mean by that is kind of what is the different kind of thoughts that you use around crafting that?
Yeah, you have to be really intentional. And for many organizations, the big mistake is, is transferring a US concept and strategy and making it, there's nothing more, as someone who grew up in a colonized country, there's nothing worse than, than being told what to do by Americans, when you don't live in the United States. The fact of the matter is that there are the dimensions of diversity are somewhat similar outside of the US, but the nomenclature and the approach is different. From a gender perspective, we can say that is the one universal. That is the one universal. We have not achieved gender parity on a global basis. And the biases and misperceptions about women's leadership and capacity are frankly even more challenging outside of the US. And so the language and the freedom, if you will, that we have with admonishing organizations for lack of gender equity and creating the policies and practices that will ensure a fair and equitable environment for women in the United States, in some countries can feel abusive, right? And can feel constraining. And others are far more advanced than us, such as Norway. And, so really at the end of the day is about creating bespoke solutions for the countries and the regions where you're in. And the way that I've approached that in the past, and in full transparency, is first building a strategy that feels as universal as possible, and then creating the bespoke elements of it. Like I said, gender is universal, age is universal, disability is universal, but every country has different regulatory requirements around these dimensions, right? Just as in the US, as we have the EEOC, there are countries in Asia and in Europe with different regulatory requirements. And so there's the compliance element of this that you also have to understand, because you have to meet it at a minimum. And I always say, there's sort of a few schools of thought on that, and the concern about, well, when D&I is just compliance driven, then nobody cares. I always like to say, I was like, well, the compliance piece becomes my stickiness, right? I was like, I can use compliance to draw people to, well, we have to do this because otherwise we will be sued. Right. Otherwise, we're creating risk for the organization. And then I leverage that as a tool for education and awareness and action that can be truly impactful for an organization. And everybody loves training, but nobody wants training to be exported and not to feel that is relevant to their day-to-day and their lived experiences. And so that, and when you're building out a D&I strategy, as with any strategy, you have to put key milestones, KPIs, set context for what you're trying to solve for, and do it in a way that is relevant to the employees that you're trying to serve.
Yeah, we definitely don't want to take a colonial approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. That is an oxymoron for sure. In terms of a lot of the topics we're talking about, how people are experienced in a company, how people feel like they belong at an organization and are enabled to do their best work, is definitely hard to measure in theory. But a lot of people want to say, like, how do we know we are doing a good job? How are we measuring progress? We're not fans of box checking here, but are there any metrics or ways you look at kind of seeing where progress has been made in this equity work?
And I love this question, Christina, because it's both the standard question that everybody wants to know, because what gets measured gets done. Sure. But it's also, I don't mean to be overly cheeky, but with this work, you have to define key performance indicators that you will track and measure with the same rigor that you do your financial and your customer and your growth data. It's, it has to, you have to apply the same rigor to this work. So, from a metrics perspective, your employee and individual demographics have to be assessed, and the trend analysis across the board. And you have to do it from an intersectional lens, so that you are not just comparing an us versus them, if you will, of, women versus men, but women of color, across the gamut, men of color, if nationality, if this is outside of the US, sexual orientation, gender identity, how long employees have been in the company, how senior they are, have they received a promotion or a raise recently, and then cross-cut that with their demographics so that you can identify where gaps may exist. This is basic fundamental data. You have to assess employee sentiment, like I mentioned earlier, and cut across the intersectional open-ended, the intersectional demographic data. And then you have to think about employee engagement questions that are intentional, measured, and creative, so that you are asking questions that are also open-ended. Like, I love to ask people, what's one thing we could be doing to be more inclusive, right? We ask people, like, are we inclusive? Do you feel a sense of belonging? But we don't engage the employees in actually helping give us the solution. So one thing that could make us be more inclusive. And that's that mix of data collection is what helps you hone in on the areas of opportunity, and also address where and if you have to iterate along your strategy, because from time to time we put different strategies in place, and some of them work and some of them don't, and that's perfectly understandable. But you want to capture what's working and what isn't in time, so that you can course correct and try something different.
Absolutely. And asking the question, what is one thing that we can do better or differently to be more inclusive? Have you kind of redesigned a system, process, policy, or initiative from that answer over the past 2 years, or just in your kind of anecdotal research and just like looking internally at the organization?
Sure. Well, I joined Vice 2 years ago. I joined on May 11th, and 2 weeks later, George Floyd was murdered. And we had to very quickly assess an organizational context that was, quite frankly, in turmoil and dealing with a lot of trauma. And I knew that we were going to have to redesign our systems, and we were going to have to redesign our processes. But before we did that, we had to listen to our employees. And we undertook a global listening tour. We spent, I spent hours and hours doing deep dives on our data, as I mentioned earlier, from an intersectional perspective, getting a sense of, where folks, where how did people enter the organization? How did they exit? What happened in between? And I'll just tell you 3 of the systems pieces that we focused on were performance management, pay equity, and transparency. And so from a performance management perspective, what we heard consistently from our employees was that they had lack of clarity on career pathing. And this is something that I have heard in every single company I've worked for. So it wasn't something that was unique to Vice, if you will. What was unique to Vice was that we had not established job levels and job architecture in a way that we were able to articulate to folks accurately what it took to go from one level to the other. And we hadn't engaged managers in training to help them, to equip them with the right language and approach to delivering these conversations. And we didn't have a consistent performance management process that enabled managers and their teams to have ongoing feedback conversations and growth conversations. And so we hyper accelerated our progress from a performance management and job architecture perspective, because we knew we needed to build the infrastructure in order to do that work well. We also heard that pay equity was a challenge. And again, this is not unique to our company. I have heard it in a company. The summer of 2020 was when these topics were coming to the forefront. And so we conducted a pay equity study. And in addition to a pay equity study, we really, again, spent some deep time in investigating and interrogating our pay practices and our policies, and how we made decisions from a pay perspective, and how we paid attention to the impact, right? Because throughout any given month, week, or day of an organization, you're making decisions, whether you're hiring someone, whether you're promoting someone, whether you're considering retaining someone around their pay, that if you're not using a consistent system to base your decisions on, you're constantly going to have outliers. And I'm incredibly proud of having not just conducted our pay equity studies. We just conducted our third pay equity study last year.
Awesome.
Two of them were under my remit. One was before I joined. But I'll tell you my favorite and my most proud moment was when the statisticians and the legal analysts who were reviewing our data, who have been doing it for the past 3 years, told us, you don't have to do this again next year. You have instituted such strict and consistent processes that you actually just need to do this every other year to make sure that you address any outliers. But we have already put in place the compensation health checks, if you will, on an ongoing basis, that while there will every once in a while be an outlier here or there, we have a consistent process that we put in place to fairly and accurately pay our employees. And that's how you drive systems change. And the third piece that I mentioned around transparency, in most companies that I've worked for, you build these D&I strategies. And if you're lucky, you have dashboards that managers are reviewing, but you don't have something that is holistically shared with the company on an ongoing basis. And at Vice, we created a DEI dashboard that is available to all of our employees. And it includes the 4 pillars that we assess against and that we drive our work around. And it's people, culture, systems, and standards. Now, in most companies, the D&I pillars are workforce, workplace, and marketplace. Those are ours as well. We're using language that is consistent with us, which is people is our workforce, culture is our workplace, and standards is our marketplace. We are a company of journalists. We're a company of writers and editors, and so those standards are really critical to what we put out in the world. But this was my first time where I was able to add a 4th pillar of systems, and systems and systems is, like I said, this pay equity, these elements that tie together all of our practices and behavioral norms. And those 4 pillars are there to be seen with the work that goes against each of them, the progress, who's responsible, who's accountable. And that level of transparency is how you redesign systems and how you bring people along to drive not just the processes and policies or initiatives that you want to drive, but really the behavioral shifts that you want to see in an organization.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing just the context behind those pillars and how you kind of think about measuring success and accountability and transparency throughout the organization as well. You fast forward 10, 20, 50 years down the line, some diversity, equity, inclusion practitioners say that the goal would be for, quote, our jobs not to exist in the future, and everyone should be thinking about dismantling these really systemic problems, reshaping the way systems were built, like racial inequity. I want to ask you if this is a realistic goal, and this is what we should be working towards, why or why not?
I think it is the most meaningful aspirational goal that any of us can have. It's been my goal for many years. We don't have a chief diversity officer at Vice. You could say that I'm ostensibly the CDO as well, but I have been designing our people and culture strategy in a way that this expertise is moving to all of the areas of my team. And so I have subject matter experts. I have my talent management team, and within them there are individuals who have some expertise in D&I, and that shapes our learning programs, that shapes our onboarding programs, that shapes our overall training programs. I have our pay equity leads who, I joke with them. I was like, you are D&I professionals, because every single day you are pushing against equity questions and decisions that impact the compensation and pay of your teams. I have HR business partners who every day are sitting in meetings and they're questioning whose voice is being heard, whose voice isn't, patterns of behavior that can lead to unfair treatment across different racial, gender, identity dimensions. And so that I believe is the future state. We're not there 100%. I won't say that. I still am the subject matter expert in many ways. But I derive such great pride, not only in seeing my team do this work, but also seeing our business do it. We had a business presentation recently that I was asked to join. And I told the team, I don't need to be there. Your HR person is usually not in these sales meetings. I appreciate you wanting to share it, but you can share our people strategy. I trust that you can share our people strategy because I've heard you share it, and that it is included with our business strategy. So this was a presentation where we talk about how diversity and inclusion is so deeply embedded in everything that we do, from the people that we hire to the people that are part of our processes and systems, to the campaigns that we deliver and the stories that we create. And it was just so beautifully described and packaged. And I know it was absolutely beautifully delivered, even though I wasn't there. And that's DEI in practice embedded into an organization. And that, I believe, is it's aspirational, but it can truly happen. And I would hope to say that it's not in the next 30 years, but I would love to say that it's within a decade, it will be achievable.
Yeah, this work should not be siloed. It should be, folks really leaning in, raising their hand, having that ownership mentality, and really thinking about this critically as well. I think that definitely makes sense. Daisy, is there anything that I didn't ask you in our time together that you would like to share with folks who are listening, or maybe underscoring a couple key takeaways from everything that we talked about?
Oh goodness. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you again. Great questions. I love digging into our culture and our systems and our processes and the change that we can drive. I think the last thing I would love to share with those listening is, engage in this work as if change is possible. That's my mantra. I have it in a post-it in front of me. It's hard. It's nuanced. You will have good days. You will have bad days. But as long as you're clear on what your end goal is, and your intention is about navigating a workforce that will work for everyone, change is possible.
Change is possible. I love that call to action. Daisy, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you. Likewise.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in employers and employees really being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to really succeed overall. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.